Hello there. My video on why Radon is bad was just way too well liked. It just wasn't divisive enough, so today I'm talking about Star Wars, and how Disney is handling one of the most beloved franchises on the planet. I know, it's not a video game, I'm trying something new. I'm a big Star Wars fan, but don't worry gaming enthusiasts, there's still plenty of video game content to come. With that said, hey Star Wars, you doing okay over there? Seems like you're in kind of a weird place. Want to talk about it? Before we can really discuss how weird the Star Wars situation currently is, I have to lay some groundwork with a recap. Not a story recap though, that would be boring and this video would be 3 hours long. So a long time ago, in 1977, in a close galaxy, a guy named George put out a movie called Star Wars: A New Hope, and changed movies forever. There was an incredible sequel, followed by a slightly less incredible, but still very enjoyable third entry to round out the trilogy and complete the story. Then George walked off into the sunset, and other than tinkering with his own films, he was never heard from again. Until 1999, when The Phantom Menace was released. Was it a sequel featuring a cast of new characters and a new story for a new generation? No, it was a prequel about the bad guy from the first trilogy as a fun-loving kid. The hype around this thing was unreal, and fans loved it, until the excitement of a new Star Wars movie waned and fans realized, wait, this might be kind of bad. Then a prequel sequel came out a couple of years later and fans said, this might be worse. Then the prequel trilogy concluded with its own third entry that was good. To be honest, these movies are all probably better and more fun than you remember. Even if the effects are dated in many places, others still hold up shockingly well. A critic score on Rotten Tomatoes is not a great way to judge the quality of a movie, but Attack of the Clones, regarded by many fans as the worst of the prequel trilogy, currently sits at a 65% critic score, so a majority of critics believe it's at least fine. With the prequels completed, George walked off into the sunset, never to be heard from again. Except he didn't, because there was a lot of other stuff going on in the background. In 2003, after 2002's Attack of the Clones, but before 2005's Revenge of the Sith, George's company Lucasfilm produced an animated show called The Clone Wars, developed by Genndy Tartakovsky of Samurai Jack fame. It was short but good. The art style was very Genndy in the best way, and George saw plenty of fertile ground for storytelling and thought to himself, I'm going to come back to this. And he did. In 2008, with a new cartoon also called The Clone Wars. This time, George snagged the role of creator, but let his new cowboy hat-wearing protege, Dave Filoni, direct. Dave Filoni had directed several episodes of Avatar: The Last Airbender, one of the best animated shows ever made, so he was definitely already a respected industry professional, but after Revenge of the Sith, this was the only new Star Wars we had, so it was a big deal. This Clone Wars show was technically a sequel to the Tartakovsky series, but featured a drastically different art style that for many fans took a while to get used to. And get used to it we must, because this series set the artistic style for the larger Star Wars animated universe to this day, with a few exceptions like Star Wars Visions. Clone Wars ran for 6 seasons starting in 2008, with a 7th to come out much later in 2020, for reasons that'll make sense later. Before that though, we gotta talk more about George. In 2012, Disney CEO Bob Iger, the good Bob, pulled into George's driveway at Skywalker Ranch with a dump truck full of cash to make him an offer he couldn't refuse. And George couldn't. Bob dumped $4 billion into George's empty swimming pool so he could swim like Scrooge McDuck for the rest of his days. Which he did. I mean it this time. Somebody should probably go check on George. So Disney now owns Star Wars and had big plans, starting by reclassifying existing Star Wars novels as legends, meaning they're no longer canon. But even for the hardcore fan, it was hard to get too angry when it was finally time to get Star Wars back in theaters. Time for that sequel trilogy with a cast of new characters and a new story for a new generation. Disney hired Jeffrey Jacob Abrams, who had recently rebooted the Star Trek franchise, and of course was responsible for the hit television show Lost. For many, that meant he was good at posing questions without knowing what the answers would be. When the first trailer dropped for his Star Wars film, The Force Awakens, people lost their minds. I was one of them. It was a huge deal. People were crying. The original cast was back, mostly along with a great cast of new characters, popularizing what is now known as the Legacy sequel, a formula that definitely wouldn't get repeated in the Jurassic Park/World, Ghostbusters, Halloween, Scream, Blade Runner, Terminator, Beetlejuice, Independence Day, Top Gun, and Rocky franchises, just to name a few. The Force Awakens wasn't the first Legacy sequel, but it absolutely cemented the trend. When The Force Awakens finally came out, it was great. I was among the many to point out that it's practically a remake of A New Hope, but it was still great. It was fun, it had great action, and it was a joy to spend time with these characters, old and new alike, no matter what you think of the movies that came out after. You have to admit The Force Awakens is a blast. J.J. Abrams did pull a J.J. Abrams and pose a lot of questions that I didn't really think too much about, like, who are Rey's parents, and who's this Snoke guy, and what's been going on with Luke? To me, these were just plot threads I'd be happy to learn about later, not mysteries to be solved. I soon discovered I was definitely in the minority here. A lot of people really cared about JJ's questions, like a lot. Internet speculation was wild, and the fan theory industry became mainstream. Overall, though, as a Star Wars fan, it was just great to feel optimistic about the future of Star Wars. And the news just kept getting better as Disney hired Rian Johnson to direct the sequel, which we quickly learned would be titled The Last Jedi. Rian Johnson is, in my opinion, an amazing director. I hope he makes a Knives Out movie every couple of years for the rest of my life. One of his early movies, Brick, blew my mind when I first saw it in college. It's serious film noir, but set in a high school. If you haven't seen it, you should. So clearly I was excited, as was Disney. Disney was so confident in the film, they promised Rian Johnson his own Star Wars trilogy he could write and direct later. The Last Jedi came out in 2017 and was a critical and financial success, but really divided some fans. Some loved it, some hated it with a passion that I honestly find difficult to understand to this day. Rian Johnson made a movie that delightfully subverted expectations and opened the Star Wars universe up to tell all kinds of new Star Wars stories. It was exciting to potentially move beyond Skywalkers and Chosen Ones. It was exciting to move beyond the monastic rules of the Jedi to get a new perspective on the Force. Not all fans felt that way, though. Many were angry that their fan theories from the prior film were irrelevant, and they were very vocal about it. Unfortunately for the next film and for all of us Star Wars fans, Disney listened. This video is not about The Last Jedi and why it's a good movie. I'm focusing on The Last Jedi because I think it represents an important inflection point for Star Wars. It's when Disney, the new steward of our galaxy far, far away, became more concerned with audience reaction than with enabling filmmakers to bring their visions to life. Now look, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that every decision Disney makes is ultimately about what they believe will make them the most money. Can we just assume that as an underlying corporate motive for the rest of this video? While this is obviously true, that doesn't mean there are not still incredible artists genuinely trying to create great art at Disney. The impact of Disney's shift was immediate and obvious in the sequel to The Last Jedi, which was suddenly being framed as the finale of a trilogy of trilogies referred to as the Skywalker Saga. This film would be called The Rise of Skywalker, and J.J. Abrams was brought back to direct. If you think this sounds like a clear response to this, then you're right. And this wasn't the only area where Disney panicked and started spamming the undo button either. After The Last Jedi revealed that the protagonist, Rey, came from nothing, a devastating but powerful way to show that you don't have to come from a special family or bloodline to be special, The Rise of Skywalker says, actually, she's the granddaughter of the Emperor from the original trilogy, who's alive again, by the way.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
I still cannot believe that's how they explained the Emperor's return. The true impact of that line is still being felt to this day. More on that in a bit. So, The Rise of Skywalker is obviously a bit of a mess, but this video isn't about that either. And to be clear, I don't think the film is awful. It has some fun and memorable moments, and a couple moments that were memorable for the wrong reasons. But let's not overreact and pretend that it's, Sharknado 4, The Force Awakens, which is a real movie. For this video, The Rise of Skywalker is important because it helped usher in our current weird era of Star Wars, along with the launch of Disney's streaming service, Disney+, which went live a month before The Rise of Skywalker hit theaters. Before we jump into the Disney+ era of Star Wars, though, there are a couple of things I skipped over that we should briefly acknowledge. First, Disney tried a couple of spin-off movies with Rogue One and Solo. Rogue One, despite a famously troubled production where they changed directors at the end, is a very good war film about securing the original Death Star plans, and had fans excited about Star Wars side stories. And Solo, with an even more famously troubled production, where they changed directors, was an okay Han Solo prequel that unfortunately killed the side story movie project due to its financial performance. I still think it's a good idea to give different filmmakers a chance to tell unique stories within the Star Wars universe. I genuinely hope they bring these back. Just next time, maybe let the director you hire direct the movie. Not saying either movie would have been a better film had Disney stuck with their original directors, but it does feel like Disney somehow wasted the talents of both Lord and Miller and Ron Howard on the Solo movie. Hey, remember Dave Filoni, the cartoon guy with the cowboy hat? That man also stayed busy. After Disney bought Star Wars, Dave created a new animated show called Star Wars Rebels, which ran for 4 seasons on Disney XD, a basic cable channel that very few people knew existed. Rebels is really fun, but does target a slightly younger audience. Dave also helped create and produce the animated show Star Wars Resistance, which ran from 2018 to 2020. Lastly, he did get one final season of the Clone Wars in 2020 to help push Disney's new streaming service. See, I told you we'd get back to that. All of Dave's animated work was seen by a lot of people for the first time on Disney+, and the legend of the cowboy called Filoni grew. Disney's larger strategy to flood Disney Plus with content didn't stop with the animated shows, though. Remember Good Bob, who dumped $4 billion in Georgia's swimming pool? Well, if you thought, the existence of Good Bob means there must also be a less good Bob. Well, this is Bob Chapek. He took over for Bob Iger as Disney CEO in 2020, and under his leadership, Disney went all in on streaming with mixed results. This arguably had a bigger impact on Marvel than it did on Star Wars, but Chapek lasted into 2022 before the Good Bob retook his throne. Next time Iger retires, Disney should hire Best Bob. I will accept Best Bob recommendations in the comments. Disney Plus ended up getting a number of live-action Star Wars shows, which seems normal now, but it was quite a risk and a massive step in a different direction for the franchise at the time. This deluge of new Star Wars content started with The Mandalorian, created by Jon Favreau. No, the other Jon Favreau, the one who set the tone for the MCU with Iron Man. But Jon wasn't the only familiar face Disney trusted to help build out its Star Wars streaming empire. Dave Filoni was there too. He was given creative control of the Star Wars animated universe back in 2016, and from what Disney has told us, he quickly gained a reputation as the nice, nerdy guy who knows about Star Wars stuff, which makes sense. He was mentored by George, and Disney seemed desperate to avoid making Star Wars that didn't feel like Star Wars. Dave wrote and directed several episodes across the 3 seasons of The Mandalorian, and got to fly solo on a little show called Ahsoka. If you weren't familiar with Ahsoka, you weren't alone. Us nerds knew, though, didn't we? Ahsoka was a character from Dave's Clone Wars animated show that also popped up in Rebels and The Mandalorian, and was now getting her own series that reportedly had a $100 million budget. Which isn't actually as much as some of the other shows, but it's still a lot, especially for Dave to essentially make a live-action sequel series to his animated shows. Ahsoka wasn't top-tier Star Wars, but I enjoyed it. It was fun catching up with those characters from Rebels. If you didn't already know what was happening from the animated shows, though, Ahsoka was somewhere between disorienting and incomprehensible. Everyone I know that hadn't seen Rebels but watched Ahsoka, they didn't find it bad, but they did find it really inaccessible. This is weird. Could you imagine if Universal Pictures looked at the last couple of Jurassic World movies and said, the fans weren't really crazy about those, especially the third in our most recent trilogy. We should give $100 million to whoever made the Jurassic World Camp Cretaceous animated show on Netflix to do a live-action sequel series. That would be crazy, right? But that's what Disney did. And we have officially reached peak weirdness. If you're still not convinced, just wait. This weird has layers. Let's start with the fact that Dave Filoni has also been pulling characters like Grand Admiral Thrawn and broad plot points from the very Star Wars books that Disney made a point of saying were not canon after purchasing Lucasfilm back in 2012. It feels like we're getting a small apology to the most committed Star Wars fans, but it also makes these shows feel like the most expensive fan fiction ever made. And for Disney, maybe that's the point. Disney listened when fans felt betrayed by The Last Jedi, and a cynical part of me feels like Disney is pandering to satisfy their base. Then the less cynical part of me still thinks this is really cool that Disney is now trusting a nerdy Star Wars fan with the future of the franchise. Disney has had J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, and Ron Howard directing Star Wars films, and they just gave the keys to the kingdom to a Star Wars fan in a cowboy hat that makes fun cartoons. There's something really interesting and self-aware about that. Now let's just hope we like the direction that the big brain under Dave's hat wants to go, or that Disney lets Dave go in the direction he wants to go. Which leads to our next layer of weirdness. Why does it feel like most Star Wars projects released after The Rise of Skywalker seem to exist, at least in part, to retroactively make The Rise of Skywalker less bad? Remember the whole Palpatine Returns thing? Well, multiple seasons of The Mandalorian, Rebels, and The Bad Batch all explore different secret plans for Emperor Palpatine to return, along with smaller references and Easter eggs about Palpatine's return in other shows too. We haven't mentioned The Bad Batch yet, but that's another more recent Dave Filoni animated show that's really quite good. It features a more detailed evolution of the Clone Wars art style and a generally darker tone. The plot is also focused on cloning Force-sensitive beings as a way to bring back Palpatine. Since this, like a lot of other Disney Star Wars shows, takes place between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. I just find it strange to spend more than $500 million across several shows to try and justify something bad from a movie that came out 5 years ago. Hey Disney, for real though, did you spend more than $500 million trying to make The Rise of Skywalker make slightly more sense? Not that what we've gotten is bad, but it does make you wonder what we could have gotten if Disney wasn't desperately trying to justify a questionable decision from a prior film. This trend doesn't stop at Palpatine either. The most recent Star Wars show, The Acolyte, which takes place before any other show or movie on the Star Wars timeline, brings up the concept of a dyad in the Force, a concept that only appears in one other place that I bet you can guess.
A dyad in the Force, a power like life itself.
I never thought I'd say this, but maybe Disney should listen to Kylo. Let the past die.
Kill it if you have to.
Speaking of weird things from the past, can we please stop trying to over-explain the Force? When The Phantom Menace came out a quarter century ago, everybody made fun of midichlorians, microorganisms in a person's blood where higher density means higher potential or natural ability with the Force. The limitless potential of space magic reduced to a measurable blood condition. This was George's idea, so we were forced to accept it. But thankfully, we never heard about it again. Until...
M-count.
M-count. The new hip way that Disney executives in their 50s think the youth would prefer to discuss their midichlorians. The more we try and almost scientifically understand and define the Force, the more we limit it, both in-universe and creatively for those telling Star Wars stories. But lucky for us, and like it or not, Dave Filoni isn't defining the Force with science, but with deep, deep lore. Dave is giving us space whales that jump through hyperspace because there's actually lots of Force-sensitive animals and a long and complex relationship between the Force and hyperspace. Dave is giving us eldritch Force gods, powerful space witches, and time travel through a literal world between worlds. This isn't just coming to live action, it's already here. This is Star Wars now, but does it feel like Star Wars? I think that's the real question. Since Disney bought Star Wars back in 2012, both Disney and Star Wars fans have been trying to figure out what it means for something to feel like Star Wars. J.J. Abrams sidestepped the question by remaking A New Hope with The Force Awakens, but that question is at the heart of a whole lot of outrage about every Star Wars thing released since then. And now finally, I think we've gotten a clear answer from Disney and Dave Filoni on the future direction of the franchise. And that answer is that Star Wars is weird. It's always been weird, and under Dave Filoni's creative direction, it's going to still be weird. Star Wars has always been a combination of samurai films, westerns, epic war films and imagery, but with magic space wizards that help freedom fighters battle evil space Nazis. This is every era of Star Wars except the prequel era, which was just the rise of the space Nazis. Star Wars has also always zigged where you were expecting a zag, which is funny for a property that tries so hard to adhere to the formulaic hero's journey. AKA storytelling shorthand to broadly appeal to Western audiences. You might be thinking, no, Star Wars wasn't always like this. It didn't always feel so strange and poorly planned. Well, I'm afraid it's time to get weird and shatter those rose-colored nostalgia glasses. Did you notice the romantic chemistry between Luke and Leia in A New Hope?
Good luck.
If not, how about the kiss in The Empire Strikes Back, clearly intending to create a love triangle between Luke, Leia, and Han? Who doesn't love a love triangle? But yeah, we all know at this point that Luke and Leia were brother and sister the whole time.
I've always known.
That's not normally how that story would go. Darth Vader wasn't even Luke's father until the second draft of the Empire Strikes Back script. The Darth Vader always meant dark father thing is a debunked myth. The Star Wars cantina scene is a movie trope in science fiction at large now, simply for being so full of weird things to look at and listen to. When George tinkered with Return of the Jedi, he added this. Does Star Wars have tiny, adorable murder bears? Of course Star Wars has tiny, adorable murder bears. And all of this was when Star Wars was under the control of a single person, its creator, George. We never think about how strangely Star Wars evolved because the defining characteristic of Star Wars used to be that it came from George's brain. In A New Hope, the Force helped you brainwash dumb guards and it kind of made your senses better so you could hit a tiny target with a janky torpedo. When Luke suddenly developed telekinesis in The Empire Strikes Back, nobody got mad and said, that doesn't feel like Star Wars. Yet when Luke uses the Force to appear on the planet Crate to save the Resistance from extinction...
That's not how the Force works.
So if constant retconning and general weirdness has always been the norm, then what does actually make Star Wars feel like Star Wars? Is it just an aesthetic? Is it oval lights and shiny black floors on Imperial ships? And scrappy rebels on desert planets? Somewhat. Is it a spectacular John Williams score? Yes, that absolutely helps. Do Jedi and the Force have to play a prominent role? Actually, no. Just look at Andor, which is maybe the best live-action Star Wars show. And it is disinterested in the Force and the Jedi. But I didn't hear anyone complaining that it didn't feel like Star Wars. I'd like to propose that maybe that's because Andor was good. Can we just have quality be the thing that makes Star Wars feel like Star Wars? As a fan, that's what I want. Let's quickly look at the best of Marvel, Disney's other multi-billion-dollar franchise, to see how this can work. Captain America: The Winter Soldier and Thor: Ragnarok are two of the best MCU movies. The first is a grounded throwback spy thriller that cast Robert Redford as the villain, just in case you weren't absolutely sure what they were going for. The second is an absurd space comedy directed by Taika Waititi, set on a trash planet that introduced Jeff Goldblum to a new generation. I love both these movies. They're great, and they both feel like Marvel movies, even though the only thing they have in common is that they're really good. And they take place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. This is how Star Wars could work, and I think this is how Disney originally wanted Star Wars to work. The side story movies are good examples of Disney exploring what Star Wars could be. Rogue One is a gritty war film. Solo was originally intended to be much more comedic under the direction of Lord and Miller. And Disney Plus shows like Andor and The Acolyte show Disney would still like to move in this direction. This doesn't mean that everything we get is going to be great, and now that we know Disney will overreact and pander the moment they have a reason to do so, it's important that we, the Star Wars fans, wield our newfound power responsibly. So far, we're not doing so hot. There are plenty of reasons not to like the latest Star Wars show, The Acolyte. For me, the structure of the show made it one of the most awkwardly paced television shows I've seen in a while. I get that they were trying to evoke Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, in which a meaningful event is seen from different perspectives, but across different episodes of a TV show, it felt disjointed. Like they're taking a fairly simple story and trying to add depth by withholding obvious information, rather than exploring the subjectivity of a complex situation. There's also a bit of lore discrepancy, but as I mentioned earlier, that's nothing new for Star Wars. There's also a lot to like about The Acolyte. The performances were good. Although the villain reveal was telegraphed from a parsec away, Manny Jacinto was great. And the show smartly played on the audience's expectations for a Manny Jacinto performance. Lee Jung-jae was also excellent, and Amanda Stenberg did a lot of heavy lifting playing the two lead characters, Osha and May. We also got a Jedi Wookiee, a Darth Plagueis sighting, and some of the better Star Wars action captured in camera. The Acolyte certainly wasn't my favorite show, but if we review bomb projects like this for petty, made-up culture war nonsense reasons, we're gonna get nothing but The Rise of Skywalker. Just boring, pandering nostalgia. And I don't think that's what any of us want. I'm not saying don't be critical. Criticism isn't just okay, it's encouraged. That's how art works. We just need criticism to be relevant and substantive. So what's next? Definitely not Rian Johnson's Star Wars trilogy. That got canceled. More proof that we're living in the bad timeline. No, we've got a Star Wars Lego show, which looks pretty fun, and more of Filoni's baloney. That actually wasn't meant to be derogatory, I just liked how it sounded. So, will we like Filogna's Bologna? Hopefully. We're getting more Ahsoka and Ezra Bridger and hyperspace whales and Grand Admiral Mads Mikkelsen's blue brother. So to wrap this thing up, what do I want you to take away from this video? My message is not to be grateful for the scraps that Disney is willing to give us. This video is not intended to be corporate apologia or Disney propaganda. Rather, let's just acknowledge that Disney is taking a big swing. They're putting control of a multi-billion-dollar franchise in the cowboy hat of a big old Star Wars nerd. That's so weird to me that it's definitely worth watching. But when you're swinging for the fences, strikeouts are more common. And the only way to keep Disney from freaking out and making bad choices is to keep ourselves from freaking out and making bad choices. One last thing. I've talked a lot about Dave Filoni's hat in this video. You might think I'm making fun of it, but I'm not. A lot of people, probably all people, would be thrilled to be known as the guy in creative control of Star Wars, but not Dave. Dave also wants to be known as the cowboy hat guy, and I love that. You wear the heck out of that hat, Dave. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. You own it. You get married in that hat, and you get buried in that hat. Oh, gosh. Sorry, I gotta take this. We're done. You can leave. Bob, how's it going? Yeah, they're gone. I told him to leave. Well, I did what you said. I blamed the fans without blaming the fans, while also uniting them behind whatever project you have next. I will definitely check my bank for payment, and it was an absolute pleasure working with you. Tell Dave Oh, he hung up.